And when you heard glad all over, boom, 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 immediately we said, okay, enough piano. And then it was a fight over who got to play drums.
Okay, stop whatever you're doing, because I'm about to tell you something about Eddie Van Halen that most people, even hardcore Van Halen fans, have never heard. You see, the world knew Eddie as this humble, warm, genius guitarist, a guy who once said he never even thought of himself as a great player, a guy who just played, felt the music, changed the world. But here's what the interviews, the backstage stories, and the rare candid moments slowly revealed over the years. Eddie Van Halen had a list. Not a written list, not some tabloid gossip thing, but a mental list of the guitarists and musicians who rubbed him the wrong way, who hurt him, who he thought were frauds, or who, deep down, he just could not stand. And today, we're going through every single name on that list. Some of these will shock you. One of them was his childhood hero. One was a guy in his own band. And one, this one still blows my mind, one was a musician the whole world assumed was Eddie's friend. You ready? Let's go. Welcome to Hidden Fame Files. Intro/setup. Before we get into the names, and trust me, we're getting there fast, let me give you just a little bit of context on who Eddie Van Halen was, because it actually makes everything else make sense. Eddie was born in Amsterdam in 1955. His dad, Jan Van Halen, was a classically trained musician, a clarinet and saxophone player who was genuinely talented. So music was in the house from day one. When the family moved to Pasadena, California in 1962, Eddie and his brother Alex were basically broke immigrant kids with a second-hand drum kit and a beat-up guitar. Now here's something most people get wrong. Eddie actually started on the drums. Alex was supposed to play the guitar, but while Eddie was doing a paper route to pay for drum lessons, Alex would sneak into Eddie's room and play the drums himself. And Eddie, he'd hear it, walk in and think, okay, fine, I'll take the guitar then. That's the origin story of one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. An accidental switch, a borrowed instrument, and then years of obsessive, almost violent dedication to getting better. By the time Van Halen released their debut album in 1978, the one with Eruption on it, Eddie didn't just change rock guitar, he basically reset what was possible. Two-hand tapping, legato runs at speeds people thought were physically impossible. Kids were slowing down the record just trying to figure out what he was doing. And on top of all that, this is the guy Michael Jackson specifically called to play the solo on Beat It. He did it in one take, for free, as a favor. That's the level we're talking about. So with all of that, the talent, the humility, the genius, you'd think Eddie got along with everyone, right? Yeah, not so much. Guitarist number 1, Eric Clapton. Now, I need you to understand something first. In 1978, when Guitar Player magazine asked a fresh-faced Eddie Van Halen who his biggest influence was, his answer was immediate: Clapton. Not Hendrix, not Jimmy Page, Clapton. Eddie said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he knew every single note Clapton played. That before he was Eddie Van Halen the legend, he was just a kid in Pasadena absolutely obsessing over Clapton's Cream records. He'd sit alone in his room and play the solos over and over again until they were part of him. That's not admiration, that's devotion. So what happened? Well, as Van Halen blew up and Eddie's name became synonymous with best guitarist on earth, the two actually crossed paths. They hung out. There was a real friendship forming. Eddie admired the guy who had inspired him since childhood. It was like a dream come true. And then Clapton opened his mouth. In an interview, Clapton made comments that were actually, in his mind, meant to be a kind of gentle guidance. He suggested that Eddie's playing showed he'd missed the deeper roots of the blues, that he was an influence of Clapton, sure, but that Eddie had focused too much on one player and hadn't gone deeper into the genre's history. Now, to be fair, Clapton wasn't wrong exactly. He was trying to pass on wisdom, the way an older musician might, but Eddie heard it differently. He heard dismissal. He heard his hero quietly saying, "You don't really get it, kid." Eddie was deeply, genuinely hurt. But he wasn't ready to give up on the friendship, not yet. Sometime later, at a party in New York City, Eddie tried to patch things up. He walked over to Clapton, reportedly a little drunk, wanting to make peace, and Clapton, who had recently gotten sober, came off as cold, distant, dismissive. That was it for Eddie. The man who once called Clapton his #1 influence reportedly called him a teabag after that encounter, which, if you know what that word means in British slang, is about as colorful an insult you can give someone. And in a 1995 Guitar Player interview, nearly 20 years after he'd first praised Clapton to the heavens, Eddie offered a very different assessment of his old hero. The warmth was gone, the idol had fallen, and Eddie never really forgave him for it. Here's a question for you. Drop it in the comments. Do you think Clapton meant to insult Eddie, or was it all just a misunderstanding that got out of hand? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Guitarist number 2, Lindsey Buckingham. Now this one is a little more one-sided, but that almost makes it worse. Lindsey Buckingham, the Fleetwood Mac guy. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does he have to do with Eddie Van Halen? These two don't even live in the same musical universe. And that's exactly what makes this so strange. In 2012, in an interview with Guitar World Acoustic, Buckingham decided to share his opinion of Eddie Van Halen, unprompted. Nobody asked him to. He just went there. He said, and I'll be careful here because he was very precise about his words, he said that Eddie was a great guitarist, a virtuoso, but then immediately added that he doesn't make good records because his playing is totally lost in the context of his band's music. His whole argument was that great guitarists should serve the song, not the other way around. And in his view, Eddie had it backwards. Now, look, Buckingham is entitled to his opinion, and he did frame it as a philosophical difference, not a personal attack. But come on, you don't use someone as your example of what not to do and expect them to take it as a compliment. Eddie never made a big public response to this, but people who knew him said he was aware of comments like these. And a man with Eddie's pride, a man who literally invented techniques that are now taught in music schools, didn't exactly love being told his records were no good. Buckingham's comment has lived on in rock circles as one of the more cutting, quiet disses in guitar history. And honestly, the fact that Eddie never clapped back might be the most dignified response possible. Guitarist number 3, David Lee Roth. Okay, now we're getting into the really juicy territory. David Lee Roth. You knew this name was coming. Here's the thing about Dave and Eddie. Their relationship is one of the most complicated in rock history. On one hand, together they were unstoppable. Jump, Panama, Runnin' with the Devil, the first 6 Van Halen albums. That was one of the greatest guitarist-frontman combos of all time. On the other hand, they were never actually friends. Both of them have said it in different ways at different times. They were collaborators, partners in a business that happened to be making extraordinary music. But outside of that, they were at best professionally tolerant of each other. And then, in 1985, Roth left. He left the band that Eddie and Alex had built. He walked away. And according to people around Eddie, including Sammy Hagar, who replaced Roth, the whole band felt betrayed. But here's where it gets really personal. When Roth launched his solo career, he didn't just leave Van Halen. He went out and specifically hired one of the most technically gifted guitarists alive, Steve Vai, as a direct shot at Eddie. The message was clear. I don't need you. I can find someone just as good. That one stung. Eddie reportedly watched Roth's solo career with a mix of anger and hurt. Eddie had put his heart and soul into Van Halen, and Roth, in Eddie's view, was a showman, a performer, a guy who needed Eddie's music to be relevant. The idea that Roth was out there acting like the breakup was no big deal, that burned. Later, when Hagar joined and the Van Hagar era began, Eddie was vocal, at least internally, about his feelings towards Roth. He wasn't subtle about it to people he trusted. and the tension never fully went away, even decades later, even after reunions and tours and one more album together before Eddie's passing in 2020. The relationship between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth was one of those rock and roll marriages where the music was magnificent and everything else was complicated, deeply, deeply complicated. Okay, quick pause right here. If you're into this kind of deep dive content, the kind of stuff that goes beyond the greatest hits version of rock history and actually gets into the real stories, the real feelings, the real mess behind the music, then hit that hype button for this video. You know the one. It's the new YouTube feature, the little hype button down there, and it actually helps smaller channels like Hidden Fame Files get in front of more people who would love this content. One tap is all it takes, and it means a lot. Seriously. Okay, back to the list. Guitarist number 4, Steve Vai. Complicated. Now, this one is more nuanced than the others, and honestly, I think that's what makes it the most interesting. Steve Vai. Now, here's where you have to pay close attention, because this isn't a clean story of Eddie hating Steve Vai. It's messier than that, and the messiness is what makes it real. When Roth hired Vai in 1986, the two guitar camps went to war. Van Halen put out 5150, Roth put out Eat 'em and Smile. The guitar press spent about 2 years writing Who's Better articles, pitting Eddie against Vai like some kind of heavyweight title fight. And in that moment, Eddie didn't love Steve Vai. Not because Vai had done anything wrong personally, but because of what Vai represented. He was the weapon Roth had picked up to come after Eddie. That creates a certain kind of feeling that isn't easy to shake. Eddie reportedly watched Vai's playing during this period with a combination of genuine respect and intense competitive unease. There's a story, and this is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing, where Eddie told people that watching Steve Vai play Van Halen songs made him uncomfortable, like Vai was doing them too well, almost better. That's a wild thing to admit about your rival, and it tells you something about how complex Eddie's feelings were. But here's the twist ending on this one. The day after Steve Vai left David Lee Roth's band, he got a phone call. It was Eddie, reaching out just like that. The hostility, or at least the professional hostility, was over, and the two actually went on to have a genuine friendship. Vai visited Eddie at his home studio. Eddie played him unreleased material. They jammed, they talked. The rivalry was real, the anger was real, but Eddie was also big enough to let it go when the reason for the rivalry was gone. That's a rare quality in a man, rarer than most people know. Now this one, I warned you right now, this one doesn't paint Eddie in a very flattering light. Pat Smear. You might know him from Nirvana, The Germs, Foo Fighters, one of the most quietly legendary guitarists of the last 40 years. Pat Smear once idolized Eddie Van Halen, and then Eddie Van Halen walked into a Nirvana show, allegedly drunk, and that admiration shattered. Here's what reportedly happened. Van Halen tried to get the Nirvana crew to let him up on stage. He was clearly in no state to be performing. He was making a scene. And then he turned around, saw Pat Smear standing there, and instead of saying hello to a fellow guitarist who had looked up to him his whole career, Eddie made a racist remark directly to his face. Smear later talked about it, saying Eddie didn't even acknowledge him as a person, just said something ugly and moved on. Now, I want to be careful here. Eddie was in the grip of very serious substance abuse problems during this period of his life. He's talked about it himself. His marriage to actress Valerie Bertinelli was crumbling under the weight of his addictions. He wasn't himself. The Eddie Van Halen who showed up drunk to that Nirvana show was not the same man who played the solo on Beat It or wrote Eruption. But that doesn't make what he did okay. And it doesn't change the fact that Pat Smear, a man who had grown up genuinely inspired by Eddie's playing, walked away from that encounter with something broken. This is one of the harder parts of Eddie's story, because the genius and the darkness weren't separate. They were the same person, and the people caught in the wake of his worst moments, they paid a real price. Okay, I've been saving this one for last, and it's a little different from the others, because this isn't about one specific name. This is about a type of guitarist that Eddie had complicated and often quietly hostile feelings toward. After Eruption dropped in 1978, the entire rock guitar world started copying Eddie, and I mean everyone. The two-hand tapping technique he'd basically invented as his own private language suddenly became the thing every 16-year-old guitar player was trying to do in their bedroom. Eddie watched this happen, and his feelings about it? Mixed, to put it mildly. On one hand, he was flattered. On the other hand, and this is the part people don't talk about enough, Eddie didn't like the idea of his style being treated like a trick, like a technique you could just learn from a tutorial and add to your toolbox. To Eddie, tapping wasn't a trick, it was music. It came from somewhere deep inside him. It was emotional. It was connected to something real. So when he'd see guitarist after guitarist doing watered-down versions of his style, playing fast, technically impressive, soulless runs, he didn't feel proud. He felt kind of robbed. He once said something that stuck with me. He said there's a difference between someone who has the feel and someone who's just practiced long enough to almost have it. And the people who were almost have it, they drove him crazy. He never named names publicly. That wasn't really his style, but people around him knew. There was a whole generation of shredders who rode the wave that Eddie created, and Eddie watched them with a look that could only be described as quietly pained. He was too polite to call anyone out directly, too humble in most cases to even claim credit for what they were all doing. But the feeling was there, the frustration, the sense that something deeply personal had been commercialized, cheapened. And by the way, does that feeling resonate with you at all? Have you ever created something or loved something and then watched it kind of get hollowed out by people who didn't really understand it? Drop that thought in the comments. I think it's one of the most human things about this whole story. Personal cost. The man behind the genius. Here's where I want to slow down for a second, because we've talked a lot about the rivalries and the tension and the complicated feelings, but I think it's important to zoom out. Eddie Van Halen's struggles weren't just about other guitarists. They were about the cost of being a genius. The substance abuse, and it was serious, years long, deeply damaging, didn't come from nowhere. It came from pressure, from perfectionism, from a man who could hear music in his head that he wasn't sure he could ever fully express, from the weight of being the best in the world at something and knowing that every single performance was being measured against every other performance. His marriage to Valerie Bertinelli, and this was a real love story at the start, you have to understand that, slowly fractured under that pressure. The touring, the drinking, the way he would disappear into his studio for days at a time. Valerie has talked about it openly. She loved him, she really did, but she couldn't save him from himself. And the band lineup changes, first losing Roth, then eventually losing Hagar, then trying again. Each one took something from Eddie, not just professionally, personally. These were his people, his creative family, and every split felt like another piece of himself walking out the door. By the time Van Halen released what would become their final studio album, A Different Kind of Truth, in 2012, with Roth back in the fold, Eddie was already dealing with the health issues that would eventually take his life. He passed away on October 6, 2020, from cancer. He was 65. Now, here's the thing that I keep coming back to. Despite all of it, the rivalries, the feuds, the personal demons, the pain, Eddie Van Halen left behind something that cannot be argued with. His music. And his son. Wolfgang Van Halen has been carrying the flame since his dad's passing. He was literally playing bass for Van Halen on their final tour in 2015. He grew up in the studio with Eddie. He absorbed everything. And watching Wolfgang carry this music into the next generation, there's something genuinely moving about it. You know, if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing, if you love digging into the real stories behind the legends, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly what we do at Hidden Fame Files every single week. And honestly, if this video gave you something new, something you didn't know about Eddie, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this stuff. Eddie was the kind of artist who makes you feel like you knew him, even if you never met him. That's rare. That's the thing that separates the truly great ones from everyone else. So, what's the actual takeaway from all of this? I think it's this. Eddie Van Halen was not a saint. He was not some perfectly humble, perfectly gracious rock god who floated above all the drama. He was human. He got hurt. He got angry. He held grudges. He made mistakes, some of them serious ones. But he also had one of the most genuine souls in rock and roll. He didn't care about being cool. He didn't care about posturing. He just played. And when people took something pure and personal and turned it into competition, or dismissed it, or used it as a weapon against him, yeah, that hurt him. Every name on this list, Clapton, Buckingham, Roth, Vai, Smear, and the faceless army of imitators, represents something that Eddie had to process, a disappointment, a betrayal, a reminder that greatness doesn't protect you from the ordinary messy business of being a person. And maybe that's the most rock and roll thing about Eddie Van Halen. He was the best guitarist of his generation, maybe of all time, and he still had feelings. He still got his heart broken. He still lay awake at night stewing over things people said. He was one of us, just considerably better at guitar. One last question for you, and I really want to see your answers in the comments. Who do you think deserved to be on this list that we might have missed? And who do you think Eddie actually forgave in the end? Let me know below. Let's talk about it. This has been Hidden Fame Files. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care of yourselves and keep playing.